Before we get into today's story, if you're new here, welcome to Ivory Secrets. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of these. And for those of you who've been here a while, you already know how this goes. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel now. Let's talk about what happens when a man spends 5 years running out right past the person who was holding everything together and only figures it out the moment the door closes behind her. She didn't cry. That was the thing nobody expected. Not her mother-in-law, who had been waiting for it. Not the woman standing in the marble foyer, in a dress that cost more than most people's rent. Not even him. Wren Calloway stood in the entrance of the house she had kept immaculate for 5 years, held her coat closed at the collar. It was February in Calgary, and someone had left the front door open, and she looked at her husband's mistress, the way you look at a weather forecast that doesn't surprise you. Resigned, unsurprised, almost tired. "You're still here," Damien said from the top of the staircase. Not a question, not an apology, a statement designed to make her feel like the one who didn't belong. Wren didn't answer him. She looked at the woman, early 30s, red nails, the particular kind of confidence that comes from being chosen publicly rather than quietly, and then she looked back at Damien, and she did something neither of them had prepared for. She picked up the single bag she had left by the door 3 days ago when she had already known, and she walked out. No scene, no tears, no ultimatum. The door clicked shut behind her. Like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Leave a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from today? To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand what Wren Calloway had been before she became Damien Ashford's wife. She was 31 when they met. She had been working for 4 years as a structural consultant for a mid-size engineering firm in Edmonton, the kind of work that is technical and unglamorous and deeply necessary. She had a studio apartment with good light and a coffee maker she actually loved, and a small group of friends who showed up when it mattered. She was not living an extraordinary life by anyone's outward measure, but she was hers. Damien Ashford was 42, recently divorced from a woman nobody talked about, and the kind of handsome that works better in photographs than in person. Polished, controlled, aware of the space he occupied. He ran a commercial real estate development company out of Calgary that his father had started, and that Damien had, by most accounts, significantly expanded. He had money. He had presence. He was used to getting the version of a room he wanted. They met at a charity dinner that Wren had attended because a colleague was being honored. She hadn't even wanted to go. She'd worn a dress she already owned and arrived late because of a meeting, and Damien had been seated beside her by accident. And within 40 minutes, he had decided he was going to know her better. She found him interesting. He found her, she would later understand, refreshingly uncomplicated, by which he meant that she wasn't performing for him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She didn't know enough about his world to be strategic about it. He mistook that for simplicity. He asked her to dinner 3 times before she agreed. She wasn't playing a game. She was finishing a project. They dated for a year. In that year, Wren met his business partners and his mother, Paulette, who was the kind of woman who assessed other women the way a contractor assesses a building, for what they could bear and for how long. Paulette decided early that Wren was insufficient. She didn't say it directly. She said things like, "You're so sensible, dear," in the tone that means the opposite. Wren noticed. She always noticed. She just chose not to fight battles that weren't load-bearing. When Damien proposed, he did it at a restaurant he chose, with a ring he chose, after a conversation that was more announcement than question. Wren said yes, because she loved him, and because she believed then that love was something you decided to sustain, not something that simply happened to you. She was, in that way, practical, even about her own heart. What she did not do during that engagement. During the wedding planning that Paulette largely managed, during the move into the house in Aspen Woods that Damien owned, and that was already fully furnished, was tell him about the inheritance. This is the part people will have opinions about. She already knew. Her grandfather had died the year before she met Damien, and the estate had been in the middle of a lengthy legal settlement involving properties across 3 provinces. Her father, who had long since stepped back from the family business, had told her quietly that when it resolved, there would be something significant for her. She had nodded and gone back to work because significant was vague, and the future was not something she built plans around. She didn't tell Damien because it hadn't resolved yet, and because she had learned, growing up around money that came and went, that you didn't count what wasn't in your hand. She also, if she was honest, wasn't sure what he would do with the information. She was still learning who he was, and what she was learning gave her pause. By the second year of marriage, the shape of their life together had clarified into something Wren hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite name. Damien was not cruel, that's important to say. He was not the kind of man who shouted, or threatened, or made her feel afraid. He was the kind of man who slowly, without intention or malice, made her feel invisible. He talked over her at dinners, not always, but often enough that she started timing how long a sentence she could get through before he found his way back to his own thoughts. He introduced her to his colleagues as my wife, without her name, as though the title was sufficient context. He asked for her opinion on renovations and travel plans, and then didn't take it, and when she pointed that out once, gently, privately, he said she was being sensitive. She started to notice the architecture of it, the way certain conversations ended when she entered the room, the way Paulette would call and Damien would take the call in his study, the way he looked at his phone during dinners they were supposed to be having together, and then looked up and expected her to still be engaged, still warm, still performing the role of wife as though she hadn't noticed his absence from the table. She kept working. Her firm had opened a Calgary office and she had transferred. She was good at her job. Genuinely good. The kind of good that shows up in repeated requests and in colleagues who come to you first when something is complicated. She had a reputation for problem solving that was quiet and thorough, and she preferred it that way. She didn't talk about her work at home much, not because she was hiding it, because Damien had shown her, in the small and consistent ways that accumulate into patterns, that it didn't interest him. And so she became, in the space of that marriage, two people. The Wren who showed up at home, accommodating, steady, running the house and attending the events and being appropriate at the dinners, and the Wren who existed at work, who was not small, who was not supplementary, who was solving things that mattered. She told herself this was fine, that many people compartmentalized, that marriage was not supposed to be everything, that having a rich interior life outside of it was healthy. She told herself this for about 3 years. It was the 4th year when she started to understand that she had not been compartmentalizing. She had been disappearing. She found out about the woman in the way most people find out about these things, not in a dramatic moment of discovery, but through a series of small details that sembles before heart is ready to agree. A dinner canceled at the last minute, rescheduled, canceled again. A name in his phone that came up too often, in messages he angled away from her. A hotel receipt in his jacket pocket that she found by accident while getting his keys for the dry cleaner, for a hotel in Vancouver on a weekend he'd said was a conference, and she had checked later, quietly, and the conference was real. It had started Monday. He had left Sunday. He had told her Sunday was travel. It was not the infidelity that broke something in her. She wants to be clear about that when she thinks back on it. What broke something was the particular contempt of being lied to, so carelessly, as though she wasn't paying attention, as though she hadn't spent 4 years learning his patterns with the precision she applied to load-bearing walls. She didn't confront him, not then. She made a decision instead. She called the lawyer who had been reaching her for over a year about the estate settlement. She had been putting it off. Grief is strange, and the inheritance felt entangled with the grief for her grandfather, and she hadn't been ready to sit in a boardroom and discuss numbers with people who hadn't known him. But she called, and she sat in that boardroom, and she learned that her grandfather had left her, in trust, an amount that changed the shape of every sentence she had been telling herself about her life. $47 million. In managed assets and property holdings. She drove home from that meeting very carefully, both hands on the wheel, because her mind was doing something large, and she didn't want to give it too much room while she was operating a vehicle. She did not tell Damien. She started, instead, to plan. She gave herself one more month. She doesn't know why exactly, perhaps to be certain, perhaps to give her own heart one last chance to be wrong. She spent that month watching her marriage with the kind of detached attention she's usually saved for structural assessments. She was looking for load-bearing elements, for places where, if you removed her, the whole thing would hold. She found none. The house ran because of her. The social obligations were managed by her. The warmth in that marriage, such as it was, originated with her. Remove her, and what remained was a man in a large house with good taste in furniture, who had a woman somewhere else, who was giving him the parts of himself he preferred to present in private. February arrived, the month in Calgary that makes no promises. She packed one bag. She left the jewelry he had given her on the nightstand. She kept the things she had brought with her into the marriage. Her grandmother's earrings, a first edition book her father had given her, her laptop, her work files. She left on a Thursday morning while Damien was at the office, intending to be gone before he returned. What she had not planned for was coming back on Saturday to retrieve a folder she'd forgotten, a project file she needed, for a Monday presentation, and finding the door unlocked and voices inside, and walking into her own foyer. To find a woman in a silk robe at the bottom of her staircase, looking at her the way you look at someone who has shown up, somewhere they're not supposed to be, in her own home. Damien came down the stairs behind her, and his face did the thing faces do, when the two parts of a dishonest life suddenly occupy the same physical space. Shock. Then calculation. Then, and this was the part Wren found most clarifying, the faintest trace of irritation. He was irritated that she was there. That was the last thing she needed to know. She picked up the folder from the hall table where she'd left it. She looked at the woman, not with anger, not with contempt, just with the same exhausted recognition she might give a familiar symptom, and she walked back out. The door clicked shut. She sat in her car in the driveway for 45 seconds. She counted. Then she drove away. She stayed with her colleague Judith for 2 weeks, a woman 10 years older than her, twice divorced, deeply practical, who made her tea without asking and didn't require her to perform any particular emotional state. Judith had a spare room and a cat named after a Canadian prime minister, and she did not ask Wren how she was feeling, because she had the wisdom to understand that some need to before they can be spoken. Wren filed for divorce that first week. She had already consulted a lawyer in January quietly, for what she had told the receptionist was preliminary information. She had not been lying exactly. She had been, in the language of engineering, doing a site assessment. Damien called. He called many times. He left voicemails that moved through stages. Explanatory, then defensive, then, around day 8, something that resembled regret. She listened to each one once and didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, because there was nothing in them that required a response. He was not asking her anything. He was managing the situation as he had always managed situations, by talking until the air shifted in his favor. She didn't let him have the air. Paulette called twice. Wren answered once, because she had always found it easier to have a direct conversation than to let someone else's narrative about her go unexamined. "You need to think about what you're throwing away," Paulette said. "I have," Wren said. "I've thought about it very carefully." Damien made a mistake. "He knows that. He made a series of choices," Wren said. "I'm making one of mine." Paulette was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's a good man." "He may be," Wren said. "That's not the point." She ended the call. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Damien's lawyer came in with the initial position that Wren was entitled to what the marriage had produced, which was framed as relatively little. The implication, never quite stated, always present, was that she had contributed less, earned less, been less, and the settlement should reflect that. It was the kind of assumption that gets made about women who keep their finances private and their professional ambitions unannounced. Her lawyer smiled when she explained the trust fund. The terms shifted almost immediately. She wasn't asking for his money. She had made that decision early and held it without drama. She asked only for what was equitable under the law, her portion of the marital assets they had shared, a number that was fair and not punitive. She was not interested In punishment, she was interested in clarity. The inheritance was hers. He had no claim to it. It had been held in trust before and throughout the marriage, and she had never commingled it with their joint finances. But the existence of it changed the temperature of every negotiation. It meant she wasn't desperate. It meant she didn't need anything from him except for the proceedings to conclude. It meant she could wait him out. He settled in month 7. What Wren did in those 8 months is the part of the story that people tend to focus on because it looks, from the outside, like revenge. It was not revenge. She is precise about this. She had been working, for the previous year and a half, on a project she had not discussed at home. This was not strategic secrecy. It was simply that the work didn't fit into the conversational landscape of her marriage. It was a structural innovation, a method for modular construction in northern climate conditions that addressed a specific and persistent problem with cold weather builds. She had developed it from a theory she'd been testing since her 3rd year in Edmonton, refined it through her firm's Calgary projects, and spent her evenings and Saturdays, while Damien was at the office or elsewhere, building a technical brief and filing for patent protection. When she left, she took that work with her. 6 months after filing for divorce, she licensed the innovation to a Calgary-based construction firm that had been trying to solve the same problem for 11 years. The licensing deal was structured through the trust, with guidance from her grandfather's financial advisors, men and women who had spent decades managing significant assets and who treated her, from her first meeting with them, as someone who had inherited not just money but judgment. She had not, when she developed the work, intended to keep it from Damien. It had simply never come up. The technology now carries her name in the licensing agreement. It will carry her name in any construction project that uses it for the next 2 decades. She kept her job at the firm. She asked for a senior designation she had been eligible for since the year before, which she had not pushed for, because she had been managing too many other things. They gave it to her immediately and without discussion, because the people she worked with already knew what she was worth. They had just been waiting for her to ask. She did not follow Damien's life closely after the divorce. She was, in the first year, too busy. She was finalizing the settlement, managing the licensing deal, moving into a rented apartment in Beltline. Smaller than the house, quieter, with windows that faced east, and let in the kind of morning light that feels like an opinion, and relearning what it was like to be entirely, uncomplicatedly herself. She didn't hate the life she had now. That surprised her a little. She had expected grief to arrive the way it does in the movies, dramatic and total. Instead, it arrived in small moments, a Sunday morning when she automatically reached for her phone to check if he needed her for something and didn't. The first dinner party she attended alone, where she found herself in a conversation that lasted 2 hours about a topic that genuinely interested her with people who were listening, and she thought, I forgot I could do this. She heard things through common acquaintances without seeking them. The woman had not stayed. The house was being sold. Damien's company had hit some difficulty in the commercial market. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of difficulty that compounds when attention is elsewhere. He had been seen at a mutual acquaintances event in the fall, and the acquaintance had told Judith, who had not volunteered the information, but had answered Wren's question honestly when asked. He looked, Judith said, like someone doing the math, and not liking the answer. Wren had nodded and changed the subject. She ran into him once, 18 months after the divorce was finalized. It was February again. It is always February in this story, it seems. At an industry event she had not expected him to attend. He was there with a colleague she recognized, and she was there because her firm was presenting a project she had led, and she was standing at the back of the room when he saw her. She watched him decide whether to come over. She could see it happening. Wren, he said. Damien, she said. He looked, she noticed, like someone who had been rehearsing this conversation and found the actual version insufficient. He asked how she was. She said well. He said she looked well. She said thank you. He said he'd heard about the patent deal, the construction thing, and she could see it. Cost him something to say it, that he was choosing between pride and whatever was underneath it. "It's going well," she said without expanding. He said, "I made a lot of mistakes." She didn't reassure him. She didn't deny it either. She waited. "I don't know if that matters now," he said. "It matters," she said. "Just not the way you mean it to." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without difficulty. She was no longer waiting for him to decide how to see her. She already knew exactly who she was. "I hope things get easier for you," she said, and she meant it. She had gotten to the other side of enough grief to understand that wishing harm on people who had harmed you was just another way of staying close to them. She turned and walked to the front of the room, where her colleagues were setting up the presentation. She was the first speaker. There is a temptation, when a story like this resolves the way it does, to call it a happy ending. Wren would not call it that. She would call it a return to the person she had been before she'd agreed to be smaller than she was. Her grandfather, when she was young, used to say that the measure of a structure is not what it looks like when everything is fine. It is what it does under load. She had been under load for 5 years. She had not collapsed. She had not performed collapse for an audience. She had assessed the situation, identified what was no longer safe, and removed herself with the same precision she would apply to any compromised structure. That, she would say, if you asked her, is not a happy ending. That is just good engineering. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read everyone. Tell me where you're watching from today, and let me know what you think. Did she make the right choice? Did he deserve more than she gave him in that final conversation, or did she give him exactly what she had left to give? Subscribe to Ivory Secrets if you haven't already. There are more stories coming, the kind that don't clean themselves up too neatly, that sit with you a little. That's the point. I'll see you in the next one.